Greetings, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the IPAF North America webinar entitled Mobile Elevating Work Platform Standards for North America, Start Preparing for Change. I am Stacy Wolt with IPAF North America. I have placed all participants on mute so that the presenter can be clearly heard. If you have a question, please use the question or Q&A feature located on the lower left-hand corner of your screen. Only the presenters and myself will see your questions. In general, questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation. Tony Groat is Development Manager for IPAF North America. He is accountable for developing the growth of the association in the North American market. The association promotes the safe and effective use of powered access equipment, including aerial lifts and mast climbers. Tony, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Stacy, and welcome all. In addition to my accountabilities with IPAF, I am heavily involved with the development of industry standards in both the U.S. and Canada. I am the chairman of the A92.22 Safe Use Standard in the U.S. and the B354.7 and .8 standards in Canada, which is Safe Use and Training Standards. And I'm a subcommittee member of the design standards in both countries as well. So again, welcome to today's presentation to raise awareness on the most significant changes to the aerial lift industry standards in North America since they were first published. While the new suite of standards have been under development for almost 7 years in the U.S., many have already heard about these changes coming, but many more have yet to learn about the new standards and their potential impact on their businesses. I will start with a brief apology that today's presentations may be a bit dry, as standards themselves have never been on the New York Times bestsellers list. They're a must-read, but they're not an exciting read. So with the standards as the foundation of the presentation and my style of getting into the non-exciting details, this may seem like the longest hour of your work week. So try to stay in tune because we have a lot of information to share with you. In balance, you'll learn about some significant changes that will impact every industry stakeholder. So I hope that I can keep your attention throughout and offer you some information and insights that can bring value to you and your business. To begin with, I'll try to address the one question that's been heard most often throughout the industry, which is, when are the U.S. standards going to be published? For those of you who may not be aware, the Canadian B354 Mobile Elevated Work Platform, or MEWP standards, in Canada were published May of this year. That's the B354.6 Design, B354.7 Safe Use, and B354.8 Training. The ANSI A92 suite of standards are now in about the 7th year from the start date, and I'm happy to report that I anticipate publication by early January 2018. Without getting into a separate presentation about how standards are developed, I can simply say that the drafting subcommittees have completed their work, the A92 consensus body have approved the standards, and we now have a few public appeals on process that must be addressed before ANSI consider final approval, and the appeals will be heard this month. So with that expectation that all of the procedures were adequately followed, we should see publication soon after. Getting right into what is the standards that we're talking about, I'm going to begin with what's excluded, what's included and what's excluded. The ANSI A92.2 2015 and CSA C225 2015 standards will remain as active standards, and their committees will continue their periodic review and produce their standards and update them on an ongoing basis. In U.S., the ANSI A92.7 standard will remain as an active standard, which was newly published in 2014 and focuses on aerial devices for the airline industry. Equipment covered by these standards will not be included in the suite of new standards, and requirements for their design, safe use, and training will remain under the requirements of these active standards. What will be included are in the new A92 and B354 suite of standards will be very similar, but not identical, and we'll get into some of those discrepancies, with the noted exception with the A92 standards and the B350 will include, and the B354 will exclude under-bridge inspection equipment. So the list of current A92 and B354 standards listed by equipment type, which are in existence, will be moved over and covered by the design standards with, as I said, the noted exception that truck-mounted bridge inspection maintenance equipment will be included in ANSI and excluded in Canada. So that's the type of equipment. To be clear, there are differences between the ANSI A92 standards and B354 standards. While there has been a desire to more closely harmonize industry standards worldwide, there continues to be variances. Some of the difference carry forward from prior variances in the existing standards. The current Canadian CSA B354.1 portable elevating work platform standards previously included towable and track-mounted aerials and will continue to be equipment covered in the new suite of standards. The current ANSI A92 standards cover towable aerial work platforms in the A92.2 standard, vehicle-mounted aerial work platforms, which will remain as a separate and active standard, and as a consequence, the towable aerials will not be covered in the new ANSI suite of standards. This is one example of why you need to read and understand the standards that apply to your country and have technical resources available to you to assist in the knowledge you need to comply with these standards. Another example of a variance in the requirement is special inspections at 10 years in the B354 standards, which is not a new requirement and remains in the B354 suite of standards, but is not a requirement in either the prior nor the new ANSI A92 suite of standards. So I need to clearly state that guidance in today's presentation is a summary of key changes and does not address all changes within the new standards. The standards must be read and understood to address all of your responsibilities. The new suite of standards were drafted with the desire to bring country standards closer and harmonize language. The ISO standards were used as the foundation for the proposed changes of both the Canadian and U.S. standards. And the Canadian standards are relatively close in design to the language in the ISO standards and when they were actually completed, the drafts were so close that the Canadian standards adopted the ISO standards with Canadian deviations. The existing CSA B354 standards and the ISO standards were written around required tasks, design and manufacturing, inspection and maintenance, safe operating practice and operator training. In contrast, the ANSI A92 standards were written with each section defining responsibilities for an entity, manufacturers, dealers, owners, users, operators. In this regard, the contrast between ISO and CSA B354 is much closer, while ISO and ANSI are significantly different. Additionally, the contrast between the ISO standards are written by task. So there's a design standard, a safe use, and a training standard that apply to all types of MEWP equipment. But the prior B354 and ANSI A92 standards are written by equipment type, such as portable elevating work platforms, self-propelled booms, self-propelled verticals, scissor lifts. And the change in structure of the standards will make the initial change from the existing to new standards seem even greater. Keep in mind that the same equipment and the same basic task, design, safe use, and training are there, but the structure of the standards delivering the wording is in a significantly different format. But the real issue to focus in on are the actual changes to the tasks themselves, which are significant and extend beyond the changes in format of language in the ISO standards. It's not just about the relocation of the section of the language but it's the real changes of requirements and responsibilities, the things that we're going to focus in on. While I can't identify the changes in percentage, it may be useful to just identify the change in the number of pages in the existing and new standards. The average length of each of the individual product standards is 26 pages that include design, safe use, and training. The new design standard alone is 70 pages. The safe use standard is 26 pages, and the training standard is in Canada is 8 pages long and 19 pages in the U.S., and we'll talk a little bit more about that discrepancy a little bit later. But you can understand that there is important requirements, changes, and details in the new standards that you must become familiar with. To provide a particular word of guidance, the new B354 standards are an adoption of the respective ISO standards, design, safe use, and training, with Canadian deviations. As I have never seen an adopted standard with deviations before, I assume many other users have not either. As simply as I can describe it, you are reading a section of an adopted ISO standard, and at the end of each section, you'll find a Canadian deviation that directs you to replace the entire section or a paragraph or a sentence of the section you just read with new language. This can pose potential errors if you do not apply the correct language. I caution you to take the time to cross out language that is to be replaced in your copy of the standards to ensure that all deviations are applied as required. As you can see in the example, the section above that's not highlighted is the old language, and the section that's highlighted is the new proposed language, and that's one section of one of the standards. My final general point in the analysis and understanding of the new standards is that you must read and understand the language and all of the standards to ensure you identify and understand your responsibilities. As an example, a user cannot assume that they can only read the safe use standard to identify all of the responsibilities. A user will also need to read and understand the training standards that have user responsibilities, even if they outsource training to others. So let's start looking at the changes in the standards themselves. Even with harmonization as a goal and having several companies and individuals who sit on both ANSI and Canadian standard subcommittees, we didn't achieve full harmonization between U.S. and Canadian standards on all language, starting with terms and definitions. This slide offers a few examples of new terms used in the standards. All machines and devices manufactured under these standards will become known as Mobile Elevated Work Platforms, or MEWPs, MEWPs. So looking at that one term, that's a term that is from existing ISO standards that are being used internationally. So get used to hearing the term MEWPs in lieu of AWPs when addressing this equipment. You'll hear me use that phrase throughout today's presentation. Operation manual is a new term and definition addressing all manuals provided by the manufacturer required to be stored on the MEWP in a weather-resistant storage compartment. At a minimum, the ANSI A92 standards require that the operation manuals include the operator's manual and a manual of responsibilities. It should be noted that the CSA standards concluded that they needed to be an adoption with deviations, and when that occurred, some of the detailed language that was agreed upon, like this definition, are going to be different in the U.S. and Canadian standards as we move forward. Because the Canadian standard for design, B354.6, uses the term operations manual to describe what the A92.20 standard refers to as the operator's manual. This is an example of why terminology is important, and while we use these terms to mean the same thing wherever you are in the world. That's why we try to push forward in the development standards towards harmonization. And here's an example of where we have a discrepancy between us and U.S. and Canada. Both occupants and supervisors are new terms, with occupants being in both standards, but supervisors only in the ANSI A92 standards. With responsibilities added for these entities, definitions were required for each. But again, demonstrating unique country views, the ANSI A92 added supervisors as an identified entity who impacts job site safety that requires clear responsibilities and training that is outlined in the training standard. B354, the Canadian standard, places the responsibility on the user-employer, with no specific training in the training standard for either a user or a supervisor. They do call for them to be qualified, so by definition, users need to have some level of training, and we'll talk about that later. Groups and types are attributes of MEWPs. Again, here's the word again, MEWPs, Mobile Elevated Work Platforms, with groups defining the work platform in relationship to the chassis, such as a vertical platform over the chassis or a boom that can extend over the chassis, one being a Group A and the other one being a Group B. Types are the ability for the MEWP to be mobile with the platform elevated. So these are new terms that you need to become familiar with. And the terms, groups, and types combined create what we call MEWP classifications. These are examples of MEWP classifications that require operator training and are defined by a combination of a group and a type. Type 1 is a platform that elevates over the chassis, and Group A are lifts that are not mobile when the platform is elevated out of the stowed position. So that's a 1A. It will take a little time for you to get used to these terms, but it's not rocket science, and after a few years, you'll forget about this conversation because you'll know these as fluently as I do today. So let's begin with some of the details of the design standards. And the design standard in the U.S. is A92.20. In Canada, it's B354.6. While most, aside from the manufacturers, will likely need, only the manufacturer is going to need to read and understand this in any detail, but everyone in the industry is going to be impacted by significant changes in the design standard. The following slides will identify some of the issues that will impact users resulting from these changes. While I have not thoroughly analyzed variances between the design standards in the U.S. and Canada, I can comfortably state that the manufacturers will design one machine that will be compliant with both the U.S. and Canada. So let's look at some of the highlights of changes within the design standard. The design standard will require the manufacturers to provide means so owners may document on the MEWP when the last annual inspection was completed. This was never in the standards. Now is a requirement for manufacturers to provide and owners to place on MEWPs, Mobile Elevated Work Platforms. And users will be required to verify that the inspection is up to date prior to use, 13 months from the last inspection. So while some companies have been documenting this on their equipment, this is a requirement for all equipment to have this documentation on there and verification by users, operators and users. What must be covered in familiarization has been a question. What are safety devices that need to be covered, which was part of what needed to be covered in familiarization? The standard now requires manufacturers to document in the operator's manual anything that must be required to be covered in familiarization. So now that will be a section within all of the new operators' manuals. When the permissible overturning moment, so now we look at limit switches on MEWPs in addition to tilt sensors, when the permissible overturning moment is reached, a visual alarm shall be displayed and further movement shall be prevented except those that reduce the overturning moment. So today, the design criteria only requires that when you exceed the slope on the allowable slope on a machine, an alarm goes off, but you can continue driving and going into full operations. The new standards require a restriction except those that reduce the overturning moment. So that's a change in the way that the machines are going to operate. The new stability test require a test at the maximum allowable chassis inclination plus 0.5 degrees with the platform loaded at the maximum allowable rated load, wind forces, manual and special forces, and here's the element that's going to make an impact on users, plus the added inclination resulting from a deflated tire if supported by pneumatic tires. That will result in an increased level of stability required at a greater slope and will result in foam-filled tires likely being used on most all rough terrain aerials, booms and scissors, basically because of the high gradability that we want. You can't get it with a flat tire. So that's going to be an impact. You're going to see foam-filled tires on many or most of the rough terrain equipment in the marketplace. Another significant design criteria is platform load sensing. And while this is a design criteria, and while no one should have been overloading the platforms before, this is new in the first time that many people will be exposed to platform overload systems in the North American market. So awareness, training, and work planning will become more important. And as I stated, although the rated workload should never have been exceeded, it likely was and will create issues for users if they don't plan in advance what loads will be placed in the work platform. If you overload it when you're on the ground, it's easy enough to take the load out. But if you're elevated and you're taking something down and add that weight to it, reinstalling it is not probably an option you want to take, and the equipment will not continue to function normally unless the load is removed. So load sensing technology has been around for many years, and while it does add some complexity and service requirements, the use of MEWPs specifically has been successfully used in many countries around the world for years. Boom-type lifts will likely use load cells to measure platform load sensing, while scissor-type lifts will use a combination of scissor stack angle sensors, pressure transducers on lift cylinders, or load sensing pins. Dealers and owners will need to get their service technicians qualified on how to maintain this equipment. There's a list of other design criteria that will also have some impact. The use of chain gates is now eliminated, and toe boards will additionally be required in the platform entrance gates. This does not require a change on any of the existing equipment manufactured to existing standards, but everything manufactured from the effective date forward must be compliant with the requirements that we're stating in the design standards. MEWPs may also be designed for indoor use only. Wind loads do not need to be taken into consideration as they're indoor only and shall be clearly marked in an easily visible place. So now you can have a machine that is only to be used indoors where there is no exposure to wind. Guardrail heights have been increased from 1 meter, 39.5 inches, to 1.1 meter, 43.5 inches. This additional height will result in smaller MEWPs no longer being able to fit through a standard door with rails deployed. This will require additional user familiarization on needs to fold railings when driving through standard door openings. Wind loading is changed from a safety factor-based stability and calculations to stability and calculations that include wind load formulas, increased impact from wind loads in the design. The impact with boom-type lifts can be an increase in the machine's weight or more restrictions on what size material can be placed in the platform. Smaller scissors, vertical mast, will be substantially impacted with an increased machine weight, counterweight, potentially to reduce personnel capacity from 2 persons to 1. The ability to design indoor-only machines can allow for a lighter MEWP design with only 2-person capacity. However, fleet managers must manage strictly to avoid an indoor MEWP being used outdoors or any place where it be exposed to wind. Group A MEWPs, or vertical platforms, may be designed with either a fall restraint or fall arrest anchors. So there's 2 different design criteria for the anchorage, fall restraint or fall arrest. The fall restraint anchorage shall be positioned no more than 750 millimeters above the floor of the work platform and has a design for static load of 3 kilonewtons versus 16 kilonewtons for a fall arrest anchorage. So by having that on there, you need to make sure that the people who are using a fall restraint anchorage, if they are supplied, are not going to be using fall restraint systems, fall arrest systems. Any design issue that impacts safe use must be incorporated into training or familiarization as appropriate. So the introduction of indoor-only MEWPs is an example of knowledge an operator must be aware of. So the design criteria has information that the manufacturer used, but it has a downhill flow to both safe use and training. There will be many benefits in the ability to control loads with platform load sensing, allowing manufacturers to design a broader and diverse offering of models that can provide higher capacities. You will find that now that we end up having load sensing, platform load sensing, it'll likely see additional capacity offered through many of the machines that are out in the marketplace. Here's an example where you'll most likely see 600 pounds and 1,000 pounds on many of the booms that are going to be designed with load sensing included. So that kind of gives you a summary of some of the elements that are included within the design standard. Now we'll move to the safe use standard, which is A92.22 in the U.S. and B354.7 in Canada. Responsibilities are a key issue throughout the ANSI standards, and while responsibilities are defined throughout the CSA standards, it is not as thorough in assigning every section with specific responsibilities. In creating a standard now that is not segregated by section, by entity. So we don't have a user section, a owner section, a operator section. You need to read the responsibilities more clearly and understand that any entity, such as a dealer, may have the responsibility of other entities. So a dealer who is supplying equipment to other people may also be a user of the equipment. Whenever they have their employees using it, they're now a user. They could be an operator. So whenever you take on the responsibilities or you're completing the task defined by the definitions of each of these entities, you will assume those responsibilities. ANSI has introduced new terms in the operations manual. As we mentioned earlier, we've added occupants and supervisor responsibilities, and specifically we'll get into the training requirements for those later on. Manufacturers have safety bulletins that have been out for a long period of time. Understand that that term has been used numerous times and places throughout the standard now to ensure that anyone who's an owner of the equipment gets the equipment registered with the manufacturer, and the completion of any open manufacturer safety bulletin is a requirement within the frequent and annual inspections. So you can't get those things done without being registered with the manufacturer. And as I said, the manufacturer safety bulletins are well expressed in multiple sections within the new standards. Familiarization. The design standard, as I said, is the foundation for the three standards, and as stated earlier, requires manufacturers to list in the operator's manual a listing of MEWP functions, features, operating characteristics, limitations, and devices that must be included in familiarization. All topics to be addressed in familiarization on that particular machine. So that will be coming out. The ANSI Safe Use Standards define dealers as responsible for providing familiarization upon delivery. And now it will read, when requested by the user, dealers will offer familiarization. So the strict liability in both the U.S. and Canada for providing familiarization at the point of delivery by a dealer has now been moved from provide to offer. So that's a significant change. And with the operators' manuals, now require a list of items to be covered in familiarization. Language has been added in the ANSI standards to allow self-familiarization by an operator when authorized to do so by the user employer. There is no such language for self-familiarization in the Canadian standards. The ANSI standard requires a user to allow the operator time after familiarization to become proficient with the operation of the MEWP. That also is only in the U.S. ANSI standards. So those are changes that impact familiarization within the standards. Additionally, in the safe use, we have training requirements. The training standard tells you how to deliver it, but the training requirements are within the safe use standards. New is that the user must ensure that personnel selected to be MEWP operators are both physically and mentally capable to perform tasks. B354 adds visual and auditory to those qualifications. So first step is now we end up having criteria for qualifications for someone to be considered as an operator by the users. The ANSI standards require users to ensure that operators provide occupant knowledge as defined in the training standard, and also ensure personnel that directly supervise operators are trained as defined in the ANSI 892.24 section. B354, the Canadian standards, also require occupant knowledge to be delivered by the operator in operator training, but does not require and provide detailed requirements for supervisory training. In my opinion, B354 requires many tasks that users do that include operator evaluation that must be completed by qualified persons. So while supervisory training is not a written requirement within the Canadian standards, I would say somewhere along the line, someone in the user's fold needs to become qualified, and that's only done through training. And some of the requirements within the standards for users in the Canadian standards, such as evaluating the operators, can only be done by someone who is familiar with all the elements that are defined within supervisory training defined in the U.S. Another element that's out there is retraining, and retraining now provides new examples of when retraining. I'm sorry, I missed a section on operator evaluations. Operator conformance evaluations are the responsibility of the user, B354, the Canadian standards, require periodic on-the-job operator evaluations to ensure conformance with the standard. The ANSI A92 standards include in retraining requirements that evaluations be accomplished through visual observations and at a minimum, and all of those must be documented for retention by the user. So both the Canadian and the U.S. standards now require the user to evaluate their operators on an ongoing basis, and the U.S. specifically requires documentation of that evaluation. The next element is retraining, and retraining now provides examples of when retraining, and in the words of the standards, would be required by ANSI or may be required terms in ANSI that include expiration of the operator's valid training period, deterioration of operator performance, the operator's extended period of time with no operation of the MEWP, the operator's introduction to new or significantly different MEWP technology, or the operator has been involved in an accident or near miss with a MEWP. So think about those are examples of when retraining would be required or may be required. And again, retraining was previously required only if necessary based on the user's observations and evaluations. The language now is getting a little bit more specific, and the language offers multiple examples of possible reasons for retraining that would be or may be considered to be included as a requirement for conformance of evaluations. So a significant change. Further, in the A92, the ANSI and CSA standards require maintenance and repair personnel are trained versus prior language that just stated they must be qualified. So the CSA language added the requirement that the owner where the MEWP is being rented, has to identify the entity that will be responsible for inspections and maintenance activities. So this issue can be very critical, especially on long-term rentals. Who's doing all of those inspections and repairs and maintenance to make sure that it's clearly understood when this equipment is out on rental. Very specific statement within the Canadian standards, not stated in the ANSI standards. Talking about modifications, changes to a MEWP that can affect the operation, stability, safety factor, rated load, or safety of the equipment in any way is how we define a modification. The B354 standards provide specific requirements for documentation, decals, additions to the operations manual, etc., when a modification is made to a MEWP by a manufacturer or by an owner. A92 adds additional language to ensure that users ensure supervisor and operators know that only a owner can authorize a modification to a MEWP. So again, we're trying to raise the awareness that modifications have historically only been those things that have been approved by the manufacturer, which is still language within the standard, and trying to make sure that people are out there making changes to the machines that can impact, as the definition would be, the stability, safety factors, rated load, or safety of the equipment in any way. Both standards include a new section, and this is a very significant area, on safe use planning. B354 calls it a system of work, whereas A92 calls it safe use planning. But they require a plan that increases prior to the user, that requires a user to prepare for tasks that include a risk assessment, the selection of the proper equipment for the application, site preparation for the MEWP. It also introduces the user requirement for trained and qualified supervisors in the ANSI standards, which includes the selection, provision of use of suitable MEWPs, the access, preparation, and maintenance of the site as required. So you can see that even when we use the Canadian standards and we say this is the user responsibility, somewhere along the line, someone needs to be properly trained to become qualified to do these functions in Canada, despite the fact that we're specific about supervisory training in the ANSI standards and not in the Canadian standards. Just going into a little detail on the risk assessment. This is a whole new section, so it deserves a little bit of time. It is in both standards, and it requires a risk assessment to be carried out by the user. Additionally, each training standard requires compliance with safe use standards and knowledge of the risk assessment by the operators and occupants. Any use, starting with operator training, requires a risk assessment, and the operator training must include a site risk assessment as well. Added in the risk assessment is the requirement for a rescue plan from height that must be developed and communicated with the operators. This is becoming of greater importance as the height of MEWPs increases to elevations of 185 feet. Calling 911 is not a rescue plan, especially when fire departments can't reach that height themselves. The complexity of any risk assessment depends upon the task and the hazards associated with it. A risk assessment during operated training or changing lights will be much more simpler than MEWPs being used on the construction of a new site. That will be much more detailed. Further in the Safe Use Standard is the provision for wind and weather, which were mentioned only once in the prior standards as one of 10 possible hazards. It's pretty much said, look for wind and weather. The new standards offer very specific topics in detail to be considered in both the risk assessment, use, and training. The same added details are provided for ground conditions, which a MEWP will be supported. So you end up seeing that both of these items have much more detail in terms of what does it take to be safe in considering wind and storm conditions and ground conditions. We have new language related to ventilation in both standards and protects against a known potential hazard. Just as required with battery charging or refueling, internal combustion engines must be used in a well-ventilated workplace. CO2 poisoning can occur when an internal combustion engine is used in an enclosed area without proper ventilation. So while we were silent on it before, it did not mean that this didn't have to be accommodated if you did proper risk assessments. Now we're adding in specific language to ensure that when a risk assessment is done, all the issues that we know can adequately be addressed. There are two new requirements in the standards addressing entanglement. A92 as users shall avoid these applications if possible, and operators shall take precautions to avoid entanglement during operation. This builds on the requirement for planning. So when you're looking at it saying users should avoid this application for entanglement, how could they have avoided that to begin with? That's in planning. Further, B354 adds language that particular care shall be taken to prevent striking or interfering with MEWP controls. This adds to the potential hazard of pulling a lift over with cables hanging down from the platform, and really adds to that any potential impact with the controls on the MEWP platform. The industry recognizes that workers are exiting MEWPs at height, and there are many situations where that can be done safely. And the current language was very restrictive in that regard, and the industry has stated that we need to address this and give more guidance on how it can be done safely. So while MEWPs are not designed to be elevators or personnel hoists, new language has been added to address allowing exiting and entering MEWPs safely at height, when allowed by the manufacturer following their requirements. The B354 standards have added language in the section saying, and it shall not be used as a crane or an elevator unless specifically approved by the manufacturer. So adding the term evaluator in that section is reinforcing the issue that we're not looking to have aerial work platforms, MEWPs, become elevators. We're looking to say that there are applications where you need to get access to some point at height, and many times a MEWP, a mobile elevated work platform, is the safest means of doing that, as opposed to scaffolding or ladders or other means. And we need to define some means to do that safely. And both standards have added language specific to care when welding to avoid use or contact with the MEWP as ground. So again, you can see that there's a wide range of items that you may have thought about before and may have thought were addressed before, but now they're specifically listed within the standard and bring attention so that everyone who's doing a risk assessment can address these things in detail. When it comes to electrocution hazards, unfortunately, we recognize that electrocutions are one of the primary causes for fatalities associated with aerial work platforms in our industry. So it's really an area of high concern. Prior statements in standards said that all applicable safety related to work practices intended by electrical shock shall be defined and explained to the operator by a qualified person. While acceptable, it's known that electrocutions have occurred when operators are performing other tasks and get too close to energized lines and other types of electrical hazards. The ANSI standards start with the requirement in the new standards that say you must be a minimum of 10 feet away from energized lines and only closer if a qualified person allows that. So very specific so that an operator understands that I need to stay at least 10 feet away from the extended boom with any reach from a powered source. The B354 Canadian standards use a voltage chart that assigns a minimum safe approach distance, an MSAD, with a minimum distance of 1 meter or 3.28 feet based on 6 to 50 kilovolts going up to 9.84 feet. So depending upon the voltage, and again, the challenge a little bit with having a voltage chart is you need to make sure that someone's there who knows what the voltage is in those lines. So having that chart makes it a little bit more of a challenge for an operator to understand how close they can get, whereas the U.S. standards have really come out with a pretty simple statement, which is a minimum of 10 feet away. So those are the difference between the approaches and the new language there. The A92 standards have included under-bridge inspection equipment, so it's a logical addition for language for working on public roads. However, both ANSI A92 and the B354 languages have language to address transporting and traveling on public roads. As we all know, it's very common to load and unload on public roads, and safety measures must be introduced to address these operations, even when you're moving equipment from point A to point B on a site that may cross a road. So there's new language to address working on roads that must also be addressed. So that concludes my points in relationship to the Safe Use Standard, and now we'll move to the last section, which is the training standard. The training standard in the U.S. is A92.24 and B354.8 in Canada. With the introduction of a standalone training standard, there are details provided on the methods and guidelines to prepare MEWP training materials, administration criteria, and elements required for proper training and familiarization. Training will be required for different MEWP classifications, and for each classification shall be identified by a group and a type that we showed earlier, type 1A, 1B, 3A, 3Bs as the example. Theory or classroom training can be offered through a qualified trainer, instructor, or newly stated within our standards, online courses. An extensive list of content required to be included in the theory training is now provided. A practical training, where each trainee is required to operate the MEWP for a sufficient period of time to demonstrate proficiency, provides detailed requirements that must be included in this training and evaluation. While in the U.S., OSHA has been very proactive on the issue of employers' training obligation to ensure that information is presented in a manner that the recipient is capable of understanding, the OSHA issued a policy statement that states in practical terms that instructions must be used in both language and vocabulary that the employees can understand. The ANSI training standards adopted this OSHA requirement in the standards to make this issue of a clear responsibility. You cannot have an employee who cannot adequately understand English attend training delivered in English and expect the training to be effective. It is the employer's obligation, or the user in ANSI terminology, to ensure that the training provided, internally or externally, is such that the trainee can understand it. In both the U.S. and Canada, the inclusion of occupant knowledge has been added. And occupant knowledge can, and I'll read the first bullet that we have here, the user must ensure that either the MEWP operator shall provide the instructions or otherwise ensure all occupants have a basic level of knowledge to work safely on the MEWP. So the user must ensure that the occupants get that knowledge. Occupant training now includes them delivering that knowledge required through MEWP operator training. And while it is not the exclusive responsibility of the MEWP operator, it is that of the user, because the user can go over there and train all of his occupants in a separate class. The MEWP operator needs to make sure that he offers that at the time when they get on the machine. So it's kind of like when you're in your driver of the car and someone gets in and you tell them put the seatbelt on. We want you to be connected with your personal fall protection on there. So it's very basic information. So you can look at those instructions, and I'm not going to go too far into the details of this, but know that occupant knowledge is a new requirement, and it is a responsibility for the user to make sure that the occupants receive that knowledge, and it is a component of operator training for the operator to provide it to occupants when they get on the machine. Regardless if the task is being simple or complex, performing the task safely and efficiently requires qualified persons to plan and implement the work. The A92 has a new requirement for specific MEWP supervisor training. As I stated earlier, the user employer has the ultimate responsibility for employee safety, and work must be performed by qualified persons, as stated in both standards. With the added requirement for operator evaluations, risk assessments, rescue plans, etc. in both standards, a user must ensure that a qualified person is assigned to the task, and the supervisor's training is a great tool, even if not a specific requirement, as I'm referring to the Canadian standards. It is a requirement within the ANSI standards. It is not a specific requirement for supervisory training or any type of training for the user. However, as I stated, with all of the added and specific requirements that the user must undertake, including the evaluation of operators, you need to have someone qualified to do that, and this would be a great place to look. It's also important to note that the new standards provide theory, classroom, online, and practical hands-on evaluations to be documented. So when you have this to be documented, new in both the ANSI A92 and B354 standards is non-compulsory annexes that have specific examples for knowledge, for evaluations, and practical evaluations for MEWP operator cards and authorizations to operate cards. So while this is informative, the examples set a foundation for some level of standardization of what would be expected within our industry. So I encourage all of you to look at the annexes and to make sure that any training that you are providing or having provided to you incorporates this level of documentation to ensure that the proper training takes place. And that pretty much summarizes the changes that I have identified. When you visit the IPAF website, you can obtain many valuable resources, particularly under the Publications and Film tabs and Resources tabs. But under the Resource tab, you will find technical guidance notes that include a white paper that was drafted, IPAF New ANSI and CSA Standards, Key Changes in Compliance Advice, that you can download and use within your business or share with your customers. So that's a tool that's out there for you to look at and utilize. And with that, I'm concluding this presentation, and I'm open to questions.
Okay, thank you, Tony. This is Stacy. We do have several questions, so I will go ahead and just jump in if I may.
Please.
Okay, all right. What ANSI standard is the towable boom covered in?
The ANSI towable boom standard that is covered by ANSI A92.2, vehicle-mounted aerial work platforms. That has been the standard that has covered it, and it is the standard that will continue to cover it with the changes.
Okay, very good. Will manufacturers of trailers, towable MEWPs, sold to Canada be expected to comply with both CSA B354.6 and C225?
Well, whenever you're selling in any country, you must be compliant with the standard of that country. So to state it differently, the answer would be a manufacturer who is selling into Canada must be compliant with the CSA B354.6, which is the design standard that covers the towable booms, and in the U.S. ANSI A92.2. Now, whether a manufacturer can combine those and have a towable boom that is compliant with both of those is not a question that I can answer, but my assumption is, if at all possible, I can assume that the manufacturers will make it compliant to both.
Okay. Who is going to enforce these new changes in the United States?
Well, I'm going to be the first person to the answer is there is not an ANSI COP. So ANSI develops standards, and they're to be used throughout the industry as a voluntary consensus standard. The reality within our marketplace is that the OSHA regulations have not been updated for this product line since they were originally drafted and issued in 1970. So if you look at the current OSHA standards, they actually will refer to a scissor lift as a mobile scaffold, because that's the only standard that they have. So to answer the question a little differently is, when OSHA looks at a incident that occurs, OSHA is going to cite what we call a 5A1, a general duty clause, and they will then refer to the ANSI standards and the requirements of these being the best practices for safe use, including design, safe use, and training. So OSHA will do that, and they can do that at the point of a serious accident. Outside of that, if you live in the U.S., you know that every attorney in the world uses these documents. So if you have an incident, be assured that if you're not compliant with these, you're going to end up having some liability risk coming your way. That's hopefully I've answered that question.
Okay, very good. Crane regulations in the United States are now 20 feet distance to power lines. Why are MEWPs not going to 20 feet from 10 feet?
Well, that is a question that I may be able to update you on when we issue these standards 7 years from now. Keep in mind that we haven't the prior standards that we're working on were last updated in 2006. 7 years ago when we went to update these standards, it's now 7 years later before we've done those. So 10 feet was what the industry was using at the time when we drafted this language. It wasn't too recently that the crane standards went to 20 feet. So it is not beyond the realm of possibilities that we may look at that language, because when we develop the standards, we look at the realm of what the requirements are out in the industry, and that may be something that we apply. I would tell you that, in the broader sense of it, IPAF has our own statements that we put out that we require. We recommend 20 feet away from a wood pole and 50 feet away from a steel pole. So that's what the standards put out, and again, you can implement things those are the minimum distances, and as I said, when we review it again, and we started our review on these standards, even though they're not published, but they're effectively approved to make these revisions, and I can guarantee you that will be one of the line items that we discuss in our next revision.
Okay, very good. Are the new A92 standards for design, safe use, and training not applicable to towable booms since they fall under A92.2?
Yes.
Okay.
They're not, so they are not applicable to the towable booms because they fall under the A92.2 standard. And so you must be compliant with all the requirements of the A92 design, safe use, and training requirements.
Okay, very good. How will these changes affect employees with current PAL cards?
Well, PAL cards are, for those who do not know, that's the documentation IPAF issues for operator training. So I'm going to answer this in a broader sense. How will these new standards apply to any operator training that are compliant with existing standards? And the answer is that when these standards are issued, there will be a 12-month period of time from the date of publication to the date that you must be compliant with the new standards. Specific to operator training in both the U.S. and Canada, one specific example is the requirement for operators to provide occupant knowledge. That is not in any of our current training programs, none that I know of, including IPAF. So the issue will be is if someone is currently trained and has a PAL card or any other documentation for training that's out there, how do they become compliant with the new standard outside of going through the complete course? And the answer is they may have to go through the complete course, depending upon who's providing that, or the training provider may provide what we call a bridge training, which is what is the difference between the existing standards and the new standards that is added required information. And all they need to do is add that on to be compliant with the new standards. So hopefully I've answered that question.
Okay. Where can a supervisor become qualified?
I'm gonna challenge the word a little bit, and by saying that to become qualified is a definition that is defined by industry standards that's somewhat obtuse. It's not really clear. So I'm going to give you kind of the definition of training. And training is the information to enable one to become qualified. Whether you're qualified or not really is the responsibility of the employer to deem you to be qualified or not qualified. And training is a tool to get you there. The standards, the new ANSI standards require supervisory training. So that's a very specific requirement. Did I do that? Did I not do that? Even if you've completed that, are you qualified? That's a subjective question that requires an analysis by someone who is going to say, my employees are qualified or not qualified based on their knowledge, experience, training, all the elements that add to becoming qualified.
Okay. All right. This next question is a little bit longer, so please bear with me. We manufacture a removable scissors lift for utility vehicles that uses leveling jacks along the weight of the UTV to stabilize the device. The scissors lift is not used unless attached to the utility vehicle. The utility vehicle cannot be moved when the lift is deployed because of the stabilizers. We exceed design and testing requirements of ANSI A92.2 and A92.3. Do you know which one applies to our machine?
The answer is that manufacturers design the machines to meet specific standards. So I can't answer that question. It's whoever designed that machine has to design it to meet a standard. So whether they designed it to meet A92.2 or they meant it to meet A92.6, which is the scissor standard, I can't answer that question because even the A92.6 scissors standard has machines that have outriggers on it. They can put a towable hitch on it. So if the manufacturer is making it to be compliant with any standard, that really is the criteria that starts what all of the design, safe use, and training requirements are for that machine.
Okay. All right. Do you know what IPAF's plans are to support these upcoming changes? For example, is IPAF going to develop a guidance for exiting at height? The
answer, well, IPAF is supporting these changes through raising awareness and presentations that you're sitting on right now. IPAF is going to be proactive in any means that can help support development of the safe and effective use of these products. Specific to exiting a MEWP at height, the criteria are pretty well defined within the standard right now. There's a list of A through M, I believe it is, of line items that you must meet. The Canadian standard actually has an annex with a guidance on creating a site-specific evaluation that can be completed. To the level that there's a need in the marketplace and our members ask us to develop a device that's needed in the marketplace, we'll do that. To the level that it's already out there and we can provide information on and guidance on, we'll do that.
Okay. And then one last question. Could you remind everyone when these standards are intended to be in effect?
The Canadian standards were published, and I believe the date is May 18th, but I'd have to verify the specific date, but it was May of 2017. Within the Canadian standards, the Canada Standard Development Group, their version of ANSI, does not allow effective dates to be written in the standards. So the committee put in the preface that our recommendation is 12 months from the publication date. So the expectation is that you can't go over and put these massive changes in requirements for design, safe use, and training, and the day that you publish it, expect everyone to be compliant with it. So there's a 12-month period that we expect people to become compliant with. So it's 12 months from the publication date. As I stated, the ANSI standards are approved, but they're not yet published. My expectation is publication sometime in January. Cross my fingers. And that would mean that effectively 12 months from the date of publication, every machine that's manufactured after that date must be compliant with the standard. You can be before, but on the effective date, 12 months after publication, you must be compliant with it. For anything that's designed after that date, well, and everyone must be compliant with the safe use of it on that date, and everybody must be compliant for the training as of that date.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Tony, for presenting today and for your expertise. Thank you, participants, for joining us. Please do keep an eye out for an email with a brief survey regarding your experience today. Thank you for attending, and make sure you check IPAF.org at the Events tab for upcoming events. Thank you.
Thanks all.